What if I told you that one man helped create the blueprint for Michael Jackson, Prince, disco, funk, hip-hop, breakdancing, and nearly every performer who has ever tried to command a stage? That sounds like an exaggeration, but once you understand what James Brown actually did, it becomes difficult to argue against it. James Brown didn't simply record hit songs. He changed where musicians placed the beat. He changed how bands communicated on stage. He changed the relationship between a singer and the musicians behind him. And in the process, he transformed rhythm from something that supported a song into the most important part of the song. Before we get into these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because this isn't just a list of James Brown's biggest records. We're going inside the sessions, the arguments, the strange decisions, and the moments when musicians had no idea they were helping create the future. And let me ask you something right away. Who do you think invented funk? Was it Sly Stone? George Clinton? Maybe Bootsy Collins? They all played enormous roles. But when musicians trace the rhythm back to its source, one name keeps appearing: James Brown. And the first record that made everyone realize something had changed was Papa's Got a Brand New Bag. Imagine you're one of James Brown's musicians in 1965. You already know he is demanding. You know he can hear nearly every note being played around him. You know that if you miss an entrance, play the wrong figure, or fail to follow one of his signals, he will notice. But when he introduces this new song, the problem isn't that it's too difficult. The problem is that it feels almost too simple. The chords barely move. There isn't a complicated melody carrying everything forward. The guitar is playing a short, clipped figure. The horns are striking like another set of drums. The bass isn't wandering through a traditional rhythm and blues pattern. Every instrument is being forced into the groove. Now imagine being a trained musician and hearing James tell you to play fewer notes. Don't decorate the song. Don't fill every empty space. Don't try to impress anyone. Play your part, lock it into the rhythm, and stay there. What would you have done? Would you have trusted him? Or would you have assumed James Brown had finally taken simplicity too far? Because what sounded almost primitive on the surface was actually a complete reorganization of popular music. James wasn't asking the musicians to play around the rhythm. He wanted every musician to become part of the rhythm. The guitar became percussion. The horns became percussion. The bass became percussion. Even James Brown's voice became a rhythmic instrument. His grunts, shouts, screams, and clipped phrases weren't placed on top of the band. They were locked inside it. And right at the center of everything was what James Brown called the one, the first beat of the measure. That may sound almost ridiculously basic. 1, 2, 3, 4. What could possibly be revolutionary about emphasizing the first number? But most rhythm and blues and rock music placed enormous weight on the backbeat, especially beats 2 and 4. James Brown began organizing his arrangements so the entire band would land with force on beat 1. Everything returned to the one. It gave the music a sense of impact, a feeling of being pulled forward and then slammed back into place. Musicians who later worked with James described it almost like a law. You could experiment, you could stretch, you could improvise, but you had better know where the one was. Bootsy Collins would later make that lesson famous after working with James. George Clinton built entire worlds from it. Prince understood it instinctively. Hip-hop producers still construct grooves around it today. And here is the strange part. To most listeners, none of this sounded like a music theory lesson. It simply made them move. That may be James Brown's greatest gift. He could create something technically revolutionary without making it feel academic. You didn't need to count the beat. Your body understood it before your mind did. Papa's Got a Brand New Bag was recorded at Arthur Smith Studios in Charlotte, North Carolina in February of 1965. The performance was faster than the version most listeners eventually heard. The released recording was adjusted, edited, and divided into 2 parts for the single. That was common practice with longer rhythm and blues performances. Part 1 went on one side of the record, and Part 2 went on the other. But splitting the song didn't reduce its impact. If anything, it made the record feel more urgent. James enters like the performance has already been happening for 10 minutes, and you've just opened the door. There's no slow introduction, no polite invitation. He is already in motion. And once the band settles into that groove, the song barely needs traditional chord changes. The excitement comes from repetition, precision, and tiny shifts in intensity. That is an important distinction. Repetition can become boring when nothing inside it changes. James Brown understood how to make repetition feel alive. A horn accent changes. A guitar figure tightens. The drummer shifts the pressure. James adds a shout. The structure remains in place, but the temperature keeps rising. Now ask yourself this. Could a record company release a song like that today without someone asking where the chorus is? Where is the giant melodic payoff? Where is the obvious sing-along hook? James Brown didn't need one. The groove was the hook, and that changed rock history because it gave musicians permission to build songs differently. After Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, a song didn't always need to travel through a long series of chord changes. It could stay in one place and dig deeper. The music could become more physical. The bass player could become as important as the lead guitarist. The drummer could shape the entire identity of the record. Rhythm guitar could stop being background decoration and become one of the central engines of the arrangement. Now, there is a myth that James Brown suddenly woke up one morning and invented funk by himself. Reality is never that clean. The roots of funk were already growing through rhythm and blues, gospel, jazz, and the music of New Orleans. Artists before James had experimented with syncopation, repetition, and powerful grooves. James Brown didn't invent rhythm. He reorganized it. He took ideas that were already developing, stripped away anything he considered unnecessary, and forced the groove into the center of the room. That is why Papa's Got a Brand New Bag is so important. It wasn't the first record with funk inside it, but it was one of the records that made the future impossible to ignore. And imagine what happens if James changes his mind. Imagine if somebody tells him the arrangement is too repetitive and he listens. Imagine if he adds more chords, softens the horn attacks, and lets the guitar play more conventionally. Would the song still become a hit? Probably. But would it change music? That is a different question. James refused to make the groove more respectable. He trusted the thing that felt new. The record became one of his biggest breakthroughs and earned him his first Grammy Award. But more importantly, musicians heard it. Drummers heard it. Bass players heard it. Young performers heard it. And once they understood what James was doing, they began carrying pieces of it into rock, soul, disco, funk, and eventually hip-hop. But as revolutionary as Papa's Got a Brand New Bag was, it still wasn't the song that most people immediately associate with James Brown. That distinction belongs to a record that begins with one of the most recognizable screams in music history. I Got You, better known to almost everyone as I Feel Good. You can probably hear it already. James lets out that scream, the horns answer, and within seconds the entire record feels like it has jumped out of the speakers. But the song had a longer and more complicated journey than most people realize. Its origins go back to an earlier song called I Found You, recorded by singer Yvonne Fair, who worked with the James Brown Review. The basic musical idea was already there. James clearly believed the song had more potential, and he later reshaped it around himself. But during this period, James Brown was caught in a serious dispute involving King Records, the label that had helped build his career, and Smash Records, where he had also begun releasing music. The legal battle affected what he could release and how his recordings could be marketed. An earlier version of I Got You became tangled in that conflict. So James did what James Brown often did when business tried to slow him down. He kept moving. He recorded the song again. Now put yourself in that position. You have a song you know can be enormous, but lawyers, contracts, and competing companies are standing between you and the audience. What would you have done? Would you have waited for everyone else to solve the problem? Would you have abandoned the song? Or would you have gone back into the studio and created a version so undeniable that nobody could ignore it? James chose the third option. The familiar hit version was recorded in 1965, and it captures James Brown at the precise moment when his rhythm, personality, and performance style became impossible to separate. Listen to the opening. The scream isn't random. It acts like a starting gun. Before the band has fully entered, James has already established the emotional temperature of the record. There is no hesitation, no gradual build-up. He sounds like a man who has just discovered the greatest feeling in the world and cannot keep it inside his body. Then the horns strike. The guitar locks into its figure. The bass and drums create the foundation. And James begins using his voice, almost like a bandleader shouting instructions to the groove. That was one of his great innovations. Many singers performed in front of a band. James Brown performed inside the band. His voice could be melodic, but it could also function like a horn, a drum, or a sharp rhythmic accent. Even the famous phrase, I feel good, is more physical than poetic. There is no elaborate story, no complicated metaphor. The power comes from conviction. James doesn't explain why he feels good. He makes you believe it. And how many performers can be identified from one sound before they have even sung a complete word? Think about that. Michael Jackson had it. Prince had it. Little Richard had it. But James Brown turned the vocal shout, grunt, and scream into an entire language. You could recognize his presence instantly. And generations of performers studied that ability. They didn't simply study his singing. They studied how he entered a song, how he seized control of the room, how he used silence before an explosion of sound, how he made the audience feel that something unpredictable could happen at any moment. Now imagine seeing him perform this live in the 1960s. The records were exciting, but the stage was where James Brown became almost impossible to explain. He danced with speed and precision. He dropped to his knees. He spun. He slid across the floor. He directed the band with gestures that could change the arrangement in real time. And all the while, the musicians had to watch him carefully. A hand movement might call for a horn accent. A turn of his body might extend the groove. A signal might end the song immediately. Miss the cue, and James would know. He was famous for fining musicians for mistakes, missed entrances, improper clothing, or anything else he believed weakened the show. Some former band members viewed that system as discipline. Others remembered it as controlling and financially punishing. Both things can be true. James created extraordinary bands, but he could also make the experience intensely difficult for the people inside them. So here is a question worth debating. Does demanding perfection justify treating musicians that way? Would those performances have been as tight without that pressure? Or did James sometimes cross a line that talent and success cannot excuse? There is no simple answer. But that tension is part of the James Brown story. The joy in the music often came from an environment built on relentless discipline. I Got You became his signature hit because it captured both sides of him. It sounds spontaneous, almost uncontrollable. But underneath that excitement is an arrangement built with tremendous precision. That is the illusion. James makes the record feel as though it might fly apart at any second. In reality, the band is locked together, and that combination changed popular performance. Michael Jackson learned from it. Prince learned from it. Bruno Mars continues to draw from it. The idea that a singer must control the music, the movement, the band, and the emotional temperature of the audience can be traced directly through James Brown. So when people call him the godfather of soul, the title almost feels too small. Soul was only part of what he changed. With Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, he helped build the language of funk. With I Got You, he showed performers how to turn rhythm, personality, and sheer physical presence into one unmistakable identity. But the next song revealed something very different. Because James Brown wasn't only capable of making people dance, he could stand almost still, open his mouth, and sound like the entire world had broken his heart. But the next song revealed something very different. Because James Brown wasn't only capable of making people dance, he could also stop an audience cold. And when he did, you realize something that often gets overlooked. For all the talk about the dancing, the screaming, the splits, and the endless energy, James Brown could flat out sing. Not just well, not just with power, with pain. The next record proved it. When you hear the opening strings of It's a Man's World, it almost feels like you've stepped into a different universe. Gone are the relentless grooves. Gone are the horn punches driving every measure. Instead, the music breathes. It waits. It builds. Then James Brown walks into the song like a preacher stepping into the pulpit. And by the time he's finished, you don't feel like you've heard a performance. You feel like you've witnessed a confession. Now here's something most people don't know. The inspiration for the song reportedly came during conversations between James Brown and Betty G. Newsom, who shared songwriting credit on the record. She suggested the idea that men had built much of the modern world, but that none of it meant anything without women. That's an important distinction, because people often hear the title and assume the song is celebrating men. Listen carefully. It isn't. It's actually saying the opposite. James spends the entire song listing inventions. Cars, trains, electric lights, ships, everything man has supposedly created. Then he delivers the line that changes the entire meaning. But it wouldn't mean nothing, without a woman or a girl. That isn't arrogance. It's dependence. The song spends 3 minutes building man up, only to remind him he isn't complete. Now ask yourself something. How many people do you think have completely misunderstood that song just because they stopped listening after the title? Probably millions. And that happens more often than you'd think. Sometimes the title tells one story, the lyrics tell another. The recording itself took that idea even further. James wasn't interested in making another dance record. He wanted drama. Producer Gene Red helped shape an arrangement that leaned heavily on sweeping strings and orchestral textures instead of the hard-driving funk James was becoming famous for. Now imagine the conversation inside the studio. You've just changed popular music with rhythm. People expect another groove, another dance record, another hit they can move to. Instead, James asked for violins, long orchestral swells, space, silence, emotion. Would you have made that decision, or would you have played it safe? Because from a business standpoint, this was a risk. Artists get trapped by success all the time. The audience wants more of what already worked. Record companies certainly do. James Brown refused to become predictable. And then came the vocal. Listen to it sometime with your eyes closed. Forget everything else. Forget James Brown the entertainer. Forget the cape routine. Forget the dancing. Just listen to the voice. There are moments where it almost cracks. Moments where he seems to be pulling the words out of somewhere deep inside himself. He isn't chasing perfection. He's chasing emotion. And that's a lesson a lot of singers still struggle to learn. Perfection impresses people. Emotion moves them. Which would you rather have? Now here's another fascinating detail. James rarely recorded vocals the same way twice. He believed in capturing feeling. Sometimes that meant leaving little imperfections in the performance. A strained note, a breath, a slight rasp. Those weren't mistakes. They were proof that something real had happened inside the studio. Today, we live in an age where almost every vocal can be corrected. Every note can be tuned. Every breath can be removed. Imagine if someone had tried to auto-tune James Brown. Would it sound cleaner? Probably. Would it sound better? I don't think so. Because the rough edges are the performance. They're the fingerprints. They're what make James Brown sound human. Now here's something else that's often forgotten. This record became one of James Brown's biggest crossover successes. Not because it sounded like everything else on the radio, but because it didn't. Sometimes standing apart is the fastest way to get noticed. And this song proved James Brown wasn't just changing rhythm. He was becoming one of the greatest vocal interpreters in popular music. If someone had only heard Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, they might think James Brown was all groove. If they'd only heard I Feel Good, they might think he was all excitement. It's a man's world. Reminds us there was another side entirely. The vulnerable side, the reflective side, the side that could fill every inch of a room without ever raising the tempo. Now let me ask you something. If you were introducing someone to James Brown for the very first time, would you play I Feel Good? Or this? Which song tells the bigger story about who he really was? I'd love to hear your answer, because I don't think there's a wrong one. Only 2 years later, James Brown walked into another recording session. But this time, the stakes were much bigger than making another hit record. America was changing. The civil rights movement had transformed the country. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated only months earlier. Cities were grieving. Communities were angry. People were searching for hope. James Brown had already done something extraordinary in the days following King's assassination. When many cities feared violence, his televised concert in Boston is widely credited with helping keep the city calm. That's influence, not chart influence, real-world influence. And now, he was about to record one of the most important songs of his career. Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. Imagine sitting in that control room. Someone hands you the lyric sheet. The very first line jumps off the page. I'm black and I'm proud. Today, that phrase feels familiar. In 1968, it was explosive. Some radio stations immediately became uncomfortable. Others refused to play the record at all. Some advertisers didn't want to be associated with it. There were executives who quietly wondered whether James Brown had just damaged his own career. Now imagine you're James Brown. You've spent years building a crossover audience. White audiences, black audiences, pop audiences, soul audiences. You've become one of the biggest entertainers in America. And now you're considering releasing a song that you know will divide people. Do you do it? Or do you protect your career? James never claimed he wasn't thinking about the risks, but he believed the moment demanded something bigger than another dance record. One of the song's most unforgettable features came from producer discussions about adding children's voices. Young black children answering James Brown's call. Say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud. That wasn't just catchy. It was symbolic. Future generations literally answering back. Can you imagine hearing that in 1968 for the first time? Not knowing whether radio would embrace it or reject it completely? The response was immediate. For millions of black Americans, the song became an anthem. A declaration of dignity. A declaration of identity. For others, it made them uncomfortable. And maybe that was exactly the point. Now here's something many people don't know. James Brown's own feelings about the song became more complicated later in life. Not because he stopped believing in pride, but because he worried people sometimes interpreted the message as exclusion rather than empowerment. That's an important distinction. The song wasn't written to put one group above another. It was written to encourage a community that had spent generations being told they were less than. There's a difference. Context matters. History matters. Now here's something to think about. Could a song like this become a #1 hit today? Or has music changed? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Because records like this don't just entertain. They become part of history. And James Brown seemed to understand that better than almost anyone. He wasn't simply making music anymore. He was documenting a moment in America, one groove at a time. But if the first 4 songs showed us James Brown the innovator, the performer, the vocalist, and the cultural leader, The final song showed us something else. James Brown, the survivor. Because by the early 1970s, the music business was changing again. Rock was bigger than ever. Soul music was evolving. Funk was no longer something James Brown had almost to himself. Artists he'd inspired were now becoming his competition. George Clinton was building Parliament and Funkadelic into something completely different. Sly Stone had changed the conversation. A new generation was borrowing James Brown's ideas and taking them in directions nobody could have imagined 10 years earlier. Now imagine what that must have felt like. You create an entirely new language. Then suddenly everyone else starts speaking it. What do? Do you keep repeating yourself? Or do you reinvent yourself all over again? James Brown chose the second option. And that's how we got the Payback. Now here's where the story gets interesting. Most people assume the Payback was written specifically for the blaxploitation film of the same name. It wasn't. In fact, James Brown had originally been hired to write the soundtrack. But creative disagreements developed between Brown and the film's producers. Eventually, he was replaced. Another composer would score the movie. Now think about that. You've spent time writing music for a major film. Then you're told you're no longer part of the project. How would you react? Most artists would have shelved the material and moved on. James Brown heard something different. He realized the music was too good to waste. So instead of throwing it away, he turned it into one of the greatest funk records ever made. Sometimes rejection creates better art than success. The Payback doesn't sound angry in the way rock records often sound angry. It sounds controlled, calculated, patient. James isn't shouting. He's warning you. There's a huge difference. Listen to the groove. Everything feels restrained. The drums never rush. The guitar stays disciplined. The bass locks into one hypnotic figure after another. Nobody is in a hurry. Because revenge doesn't need to hurry. That might be the most brilliant thing about the entire record. James understood that real confidence doesn't yell. It waits. Now here's something musicians absolutely love about this recording. Almost every instrument leaves space. Nobody is trying to dominate the arrangement. That space creates tension. Modern producers talk constantly about leaving room in the mix. James Brown was already mastering that idea decades earlier. Every instrument has a purpose. Nothing feels wasted. Nothing feels accidental. And yet, it still sounds effortless. That's one of the hardest things to achieve in music. Making difficult things sound easy. Now imagine sitting behind the recording console. Nobody knows this record will become one of the most sampled songs in history. Nobody knows hip-hop producers will still be pulling pieces from James Brown records decades later. Nobody knows breakdancers will build routines around these grooves. Nobody knows DJs will keep discovering new James Brown drum breaks. They're simply making another record. Or so they think. Here's a question for you. Have you ever noticed that some songs never really disappear? They don't stay on the charts forever. They don't always get constant radio play. But somehow, they're always there. A commercial, a movie, a television show. Another artist samples them. A DJ rediscovers them. That's the Payback. It never left. It simply kept finding new audiences. And that's one of the greatest measures of influence. Not how successful a song is when it's released, but how many generations continue finding reasons to use it. Now here's something that often surprises younger listeners. James Brown may be one of the most sampled artists in the history of recorded music. Thousands of songs contain pieces of James Brown recordings. Sometimes it's a drum break. Sometimes it's a horn stab. Sometimes it's a vocal. Sometimes it's just a tiny groove lasting a second or two. But those tiny moments helped build hip-hop. Imagine New York in the late 1970s. Block parties, turntables. 2 copies of the same record. DJs extending the instrumental breaks so dancers could keep moving. Which records kept showing up? James Brown. Over and over and over again. Without James Brown, does hip-hop still happen? Probably. But does it sound the same? I honestly don't think it does. Because James Brown gave DJs something priceless. The perfect groove. Then came breakdancing. Listen to the name. Breakdancing. It literally comes from the musical breaks DJs were extending. Many of those breaks came directly from James Brown records. Now imagine telling James Brown back in 1965, one day, kids are going to put pieces of your records on turntables and invent an entirely new form of music. Would he have believed you? I'm not sure anyone would have. And that's what makes influence so fascinating. The people changing history rarely know they're changing history while they're doing it. Now let's go back to something we talked about at the very beginning. Remember when I asked who invented funk? Maybe that's actually the wrong question. Maybe the better question is, who changed popular music the most? Because look at the evidence. Michael Jackson openly studied James Brown. Watch Michael's footwork. Watch his spins. Watch the way he commands an audience. The fingerprints are everywhere. Prince learned from him. Bruno Mars has talked about the influence. George Clinton expanded the musical ideas. Rick James built on the grooves. Public Enemy sampled him. Dr. Dre sampled him. Eric B. and Rakim sampled him. The list goes on, and on, and on. It isn't just one genre. It's all of them. Soul, funk, disco, hip-hop, R&B, pop, rock. Even modern country occasionally borrows from rhythms James Brown popularized. That's extraordinary. Very few artists can honestly say they changed multiple genres. James Brown changed almost every genre that came after him. Now here's something I've always found interesting. People often compare James Brown to Elvis Presley, or the Beatles, or Michael Jackson, and I understand why. They're all giants, but maybe James Brown belongs in a different conversation. Because Elvis changed popular culture. The Beatles changed songwriting. Michael Jackson changed pop performance. James Brown changed rhythm itself. That's a different kind of influence. You can copy someone's hairstyle. You can imitate someone's dance moves. You can even borrow someone's songwriting style. But changing the way musicians feel the beat? That's incredibly rare. Now let me ask you one last question. Imagine music history without James Brown. No, Papa's got a brand new bag. No, I feel good. No, it's a man's world. No, Say It Loud. No, the Payback. Would Prince still become Prince? Would Michael Jackson perform the same way? Would George Clinton build Parliament the way he did? Would hip-hop develop with the same sound? Would Bruno Mars perform the same way today? Maybe, maybe not. Personally, I think music would sound completely different. And that's the mark of true greatness. It's not simply writing songs people remember. It's changing the possibilities for everyone who comes afterward. James Brown didn't just leave us incredible records. He left us a new musical language, one built on groove, precision, emotion, discipline, and fearless originality. So now I want to hear from you. Did we choose the right 5 songs? Or would you have included Cold Sweat, Sex Machine? Please, 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 get up off of that thing. Drop your top 5 James Brown songs in the comments. I have a feeling this one is going to spark a pretty serious debate. And honestly, that's exactly what great music should do. It should make us argue. It should make us remember. And it should make us go back and listen one more time. So the next time you hear Michael Jackson slide across a stage, or Prince tear into a groove, or a hip-hop producer drop a classic drum break, listen a little closer, because somewhere underneath all of it, you just might hear James Brown. Until next time, relax, spark one up, and keep that turntable spinning.